Presented here for your consideration is a satirical Socratic dialogue offering philosophical musings of a rambling nature on matters related to affordance, knowledge, and massively open online courses. It is designed to be performed out loud with gusto and conviction. Oration of the references is optional, though verbal recitation in the style of a Gregorian chant is advised. Two scientists in lab coats, Wilbur and Orville, are seated at a table in a research institute cafeteria, sipping double decaf lattes whilst in the grip of a torrid discussion on matters philosophical and otherwise. However, due to technical difficulties with the software that we are using to produce this animation, we can only show our characters wandering around in an empty paddock, occasionally surrounded by some cows with some opinions. We may as well go back to that crazy notion of knowledge pills. The green one is Business Computing 101 and the purple one is Kantian Ethics and so on.
Wisdom that you can swallow and digest makes as much sense as edible underwear.
Don't knock it if you've never tried it. We will never get this project off the ground at the rate we're going. The Mucosaurus infestation will run rampant and it will be on our heads.
Mook. Mac. Mook. I wish you wouldn't call it that. I prefer Mookzilla and don't remind me of the confusion with Netscape, please. You worry too much, Si. The affordance angle is the way to go.
Orville, why are you so obsessed with this notion of affordances? We can't afford, pun intended, to waste time stumbling down yet another blind alley. Tell me why they are so special, in 25 words or less, preferably.
Well, Wilbur, a waste of time it would be if we didn't give affordance the consideration an entity deserves. We must consider that our design needs to be aware of as many possible actions that a typical user would or could perform on a system. As a doorknob affords twisting, our design must afford actions yet to be listed.
Are you talking about J.J. Gibson's concept of affordance? You know, the theory that the world is perceived not only in how a thing looks like in shape and spatial relationships to other things, but also in terms of that thing's possibilities for action?
You could have just bullet pointed the pompous signposting as perception directs action.
Personally, I'd use drives rather than directs, but that's just me being anal. You still haven't answered my question though. Our grant is supposed to be financing applied research to address the impending MOOC crisis. How is something theoretical like affordances going to help us?
Beware of the MOOCs. Let me spell it out. Massive open online courses are a virus, en masse, poised to destroy higher education as we know it.
Stop sounding as if you're in a bad 1950s Hollywood monster film and concentrate. MOOCs are a knowledge exchange system that allows remote engagement by the great unwashed. Remember Plutarch's quote, "The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be kindled"? If MOOCs are a virus, then they are a positive one that kindles the mind's fire. Is there a connection between affordance theory and knowledge then?
The concept of affordance allows for actions, perceived or otherwise, to enable the transmutation of information to knowledge. The affordances are, as you say, actions that guide the unsuspecting to a desired goal.
You're confusing yourself. It's not actions that are perceived, it's the reverse. What we see, hear, touch or feel influences or even determines what we can do. Affordance is essentially an intuitive process that was originally part of a general theory of perception. Once again, Gibson and his ecological approach that focuses on the relationship between an organism and its environment. There exist higher order stimulus variables in an environment which are detected via direct perception by an organism as cues for action. These cues are affordances.
If you say so.
Don't interrupt my inspired rant. And then you say that affordance enables the transmutation of information to knowledge. That reeks of digital alchemy. Wave a magic wand, will you, mate? There's information, like bits and bytes, or the capital of Suriname.
What is the capital of Suriname, by the way?
Paramaribo, and let me finish. And then there's knowledge, which no one since Plato has been able to button down with an unambiguous definition. Which brings me to that transcendent notion known as wisdom, and please don't get me started on that.
It's kind of ironic that modern knowledge management seems to be the old-fashioned expert systems there, in inverted commas, rehashed now that you mention that. Old wine in new bottles, I suppose. Or how can you manage something that you can't readily define?
Don't go off on a tangent. Back to Gibson. One of his affordances in visual perception is superimposition, namely that if the image of one object blocks the image of another, the first object is thought of or seen as being closer. A more mundane example. The affordance of a hammer is the visual and tactile cue of the long handle. A human can guess that the operation of this object is most effective when used via this end. How can knowledge have an affordance? Give me some examples.
Knowledge on its own does not have affordance, but the designed action or actions which lead to eventual knowledge can be classified as an affordance. Therefore, knowledge is effectively supplemented by a number of affordances.
But to supplement means to add an extra element to something. If an affordance adds an amount to knowledge, then would that change what was already there? It would be better to think of an affordance as being an attribute of some kind of knowledge. Try and convince me otherwise.
Like the game designer planning cleverly placed affordances throughout a level so that the gamer gets and retains information about the game strategies. After several scenes or levels played, the gamer will acquire knowledge of what needs to be done the next time in a similar circumstance or scenario.
Sounds like what you're talking about are cheat codes or lame Easter eggs.
The recognition of pattern leads to knowledge.
That should be on a t-shirt. My digression before about affordances being attributes of knowledge made me think of good old-fashioned learning objects. To me, that fad took a lot from traditional object-oriented program design theory. An object is an instance of a class and all that sort of thing. Plus, attributes were involved and classes even had behaviours, which makes me think that affordances could be the analogue of behaviours of knowledge. One way of looking at knowledge is that to have it involves an awareness acquired through experience of information.
And awareness leads to the thorny concept of consciousness. By the way, learning objects were considered to be modular digital resources to aid in learning activities, and as such, notoriously difficult to define, much like knowledge itself.
Is a MOOC a learning object, or is it a collection of these?
Let's assume it's a collection of these brilliantly designed learning objects, each containing a set of behaviours. An object would then, and should, behave in a certain manner according to the input that the student user of the MOOC chooses to invoke. Let's not forget that the object must have some predefined behaviour as well. This means that the predefined behaviour will incite actions which must have theoretically come from an affordance.
So, you are agreeing with me then, in part at least. Affordances equate to behaviours in class-like entities. If the class metaphor is applied to knowledge per se, then affordance is akin to a particular behaviour of the latter. I suppose we can also construe behaviour in this context to be like a process.
I think you're still partially full of it, but I can dig what you just said. It can be argued that an affordance incites behaviour. Therefore, with the correct affordance and a well-defined set of learning patterns, we can fan the flames of desire to gain knowledge by those who trek into the MOOC for wisdom. MOOC. MOOC.
Affordances as a catalyst for curiosity? You just uttered the magic word wisdom, by the way. I take that to be transcendent knowledge, something with that extra dollop of value. If MOOCs are seen to be the new Oracle of Delphi, recast as a digital collective because of the perceived wisdom therein, then how can we defeat them?
Wisdom is the quality of having experienced knowledge and good judgment. As we have seen so far, MOOCs don't exhibit a planned affordance-knowledge relationship, and the hard work of experience and judgment are still left to the student, which makes the future of MOOCs look bleak. We don't have to defeat them, just let them be part of the greater overall system.
Should we fear them or rebrand them, and how? Dr. Orville, please elucidate in those dulcet tones of yours.
When you say fear them, mankind throughout history has always feared the unknown. So let's expose the structure of future MOOCs and use a system called Open MOOC. The system is built around a concept that the designers have called the knowledge pill. Not an actual pill, virtual one. A metaphor, if you will, with medical undertones. Each knowledge pill is associated with all the elements that make up a course: documents, videos, forums, homework, exams, and so forth. So it's assumed that these pills do contain building blocks to attain knowledge.
Virtual tablets, you say? Take 2 iPads each morning before a meal with a glass of water. That was a joke, dude. However, I do have a great idea that involves cognitive suppositories, but more on that later. What about this perceived wisdom thing?
You also mentioned rebranding. They should be taken for what they are: an online tool that makes teaching and learning convenient, like a fast food shop feeding the fast-moving horde of people on their way from one meeting to another. The MOOC is there to fit education into the busy schedule of people on the move. It will be quite a while before we see the equivalent of face-to-face education being mapped by technology. Think of it, an artificial intelligence that is intelligent enough and fast enough to replace the living, breathing teacher that could respond to random questions and body language to boot. MOOC, not yet though.
I've always thought that good old-fashioned AI was like selling snake oil remedies, but your pedagogic fast food analogy makes me think that what we are trying to package and distribute is Kentucky Fried Knowledge. Do you want battered learning objects with those fries?
Okay, Dr. Sarcasm, please let me continue. The structure of MOOCs is basically redesigning the current delivery system and trying to open up channels of social networking as a substitute for the current communication system, the teacher.
I will grant you that concession.
Just putting a video on the screen, discussing it, and then checking to see how much of it you memorised is not what education is about. How do we recreate the face-to-face scenario, but at the convenience of the student? To improve, we must look at a system that provides education on the run. Do we go mcMOOC, or is it just turning full circle?
By mcMOOC, I assume that you are referring to the evolutionary spectrum of higher education, from sacred vocation in life to corporatization and now on to digital infotainment, a kind of academic idol mentality. What do we do now?
Well, I wonder what Aristotle would have thought about the MOOC concept when he was slumming at teaching Alexander the Great. Would he have taken offence to teaching through a set of windows connected over vast distances, through long lines of ceramic pipes, while cooped up in a room far from the students he was waxing lyrical to? I suspect he would have been an advocate for the importance of gesture while teaching, as it's an extremely important phenomenon lacking in any remote learning environment. Garden variety academics do still lecture in theatres, fill the room with intelligence.
An obscure quote from the 70s semi-classic film The Paper Chase, I do believe, uttered by Harvard Don Professor Charles W. Kingsfield Jr. during a Socratic verbal joust in one of that movie's many lecture theatre scenes.
You should get a Nobel Prize for Trivial Pursuit. Lecture theatres are where the best teachers perform and always have since the day of Agora. Can technology emulate this? Sure, the 90s featured talk of the computer as theatre metaphor, but the notion bit the dust prematurely. There is much to do with MOOCs, even the little things like how can a MOOC subtly communicate an unspoken cognitive state are still in the too hard basket.
One problem still is that damn name that is the butt of all jokes. You do realise that MOOC with a K is Italian-American slang for jackass, or someone who has had sexual relations with their mother.
Paging Dr. Palooka, you've been torrenting far too many Martin Scorsese films. I wouldn't worry about all this for the reason that MOOC course completion rates are notoriously low based on recent estimates. Students register for courses and then fail to even look at the content. It's like borrowing a novel from a library, but not reading it.
Preemptive hoarding of knowledge is what you are alluding to. Maybe MOOCs will only ever become relevant when they start being pirated.
Please elaborate along another twisty path of discretions.
The number and associated speed of illegal downloads can be considered a crude metric of the popularity of a particular digital commodity. Game of Thrones is a hot TV series at the moment, not just because it is super cool, but also because it is being torrented like crazy, especially by those convicts in Australia. Can higher education be pirated? When that happens to MOOCs, then they will be big time. That's my $2 theory, at least.
How can you pirate something that's free? Besides, some of those involved in illegal downloading might be simply accumulating and not consuming, filling up hard drives galore with stuff for a future viewing bucket list can't be used as a measure of cultural zeitgeist.
Language is a virus from outer space, and distraction is a plague from the internet. This non sequitur is brought to you by William S. Burroughs and bent all out of shape with an add-on by yours truly, since I didn't have the time to compose a haiku set to stun.
I see that you're having one of your moments. There are also equity issues in MOOC usage for a supposedly liberating technology, since female students appeared to be marginalised in these early times, as well as those from undeveloped countries. With a nod to Charles Dickens, MOOCs are the best of higher education and the worst of higher education. But they are not the vanguard of a new age of wisdom. The bark of their publicity is worse than their bite.
Socrates would have appreciated that true wisdom can only emerge through engaged discussion, preferably live and in person. All right. We should cease and desist being amateur philosophers for the moment and fall back onto something more pragmatic. You are beginning to sound like a blogger who's stuck on the same groove, by the way. If I was grading you, the comment would be lacking depth in rational argumentation and marshalling of evidence. Let's just agree to disagree, finish our coffee, and get back to work.
What if all this lofty interaction that we just had was pretentious snippets of dialogue in a stale, half-baked conference paper attempted to be experimental in style?
That's far too meta, even for me. Please shut up and re-enter reality.
The end. Exeunt omnes. And that's all, folks, I suppose.
Whatever happened to dry white dog turds?
What?
Exactly.
McMOOC.